Victor Halstead slammed the ledger down on the counter so hard that the tin cups rattled on their hooks, and every person inside the Red Hollow trading post went still. "You think I don't see what you're doing," he said, his voice carrying the particular cruelty of a man who had never once been told no. Pointed a thick finger at Mara Whitfield, who stood near the dry goods shelf, with her daughter pressed close against her side. 3 months behind, Mara. 3. I've been more than patient with you. Mara kept her chin level. She had practiced this keeping her face neutral when everything inside her was shaking. "I have the payment," she said. "Partial, but I have it." Partial. Victor said the word like it tasted bad. He looked around at the other customers, pulling them in as his audience. "You hear that? Woman owes $40, and she comes in here with what, 12? 15? 17, Mara said quietly. 17. He let the silence sit. Then he looked down at Lydia, standing there in her gray dress, with the careful stitching along the collar, where her mother had repaired it twice already, and something shifted in his expression. Not to softness, to something worse. "That dress," he said almost to himself. Then louder, "Lord Almighty, is that the same dress she wore last winter?" Lydia looked down. She was 10 years old, and she already understood what was happening. If you've ever watched someone use a child as a weapon, if you've ever seen a grown man aim his contempt at someone too small to fight back then, you know what the people in that trading post felt in that moment. Some of them looked away. Some of them found something very interesting to examine on the shelf nearest them. Only one person kept watching, and he was standing near the fireplace at the back of the room, close enough to hear everything, still enough that nobody had noticed him yet. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Stories like this one, every week, about the people nobody saw coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment below with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started badly before it got worse. Mara Whitfield rose before dawn, the way she always did, not because she was ambitious, but because there was no one else. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 14 months, taken by a chest fever the previous winter that had moved through the valley like a slow fire, taking 3 men from smaller farms and leaving their families to figure out the math of survival on their own. Mara was 34 years old. She had rough hands, one dress that still fit her properly, and a daughter who had inherited Thomas's wide, serious eyes and his habit of going quiet instead of crying when things got hard. The farm was 40 acres of Montana flatland that Thomas had spent 6 years breaking and shaping into something that produced. In a good year, with decent rain and no early frost, they could clear enough from the wheat crop to pay their debts and set a little aside. Thomas had always been careful about the debts. He'd borrowed from Victor Halstead's bank to buy seed the spring before he died, and the repayment terms had seemed manageable at the time. 10% annual interest, a 5-year note. Thomas had shaken Victor's hand on it and come home satisfied. What was written in the actual contract was something else. Mara had not read it closely when she signed it after Thomas died. She'd been sitting in Victor's office with Lydia, asleep in the chair beside her, and she'd been operating on 3 hours of sleep and the kind of grief that doesn't feel like sadness so much as a permanent ringing in the ears. Victor had explained it in broad terms. She'd signed. She'd thought she understood. She had not understood. But that was a problem that would announce itself in time. On this particular morning, in January of 1885, Mara was focused on the more immediate arithmetic. $17 in a tin box under the floorboard, $40 owed by the 15th, and a daughter who had outgrown her boots and was now wearing 2 pairs of wool socks stuffed into the old ones to keep her feet from going numb. "Mama," Lydia said, appearing in the kitchen doorway already dressed, her dark hair braided with the practiced neatness of a child who had learned early to take care of her own appearance. "Are we going to town?" "We are. Can I get ribbon?" Mara looked at her daughter. Lydia was not a child who asked for things often. She'd learned not to. But sometimes, in the way she'd pause in front of the dry goods window, or the way she'd run her fingers lightly over fabric samples without pulling anything down. Mara could see the want in her, carefully contained, carefully managed, the way children manage wanting when they've been told often enough that things cost money. "We'll see," Mara said, which both of them knew meant no. They walked the 2 miles into Red Hollow because the horse had thrown a shoe the week before, and Mara hadn't had the cash to get it reset. Cold was the kind that Montana produces in January, like it's proud of itself, not just cold but mean, with a wind that found the gaps in your coat and went looking for more. Lydia walked without complaint. She'd learned that from her father, too. Red Hollow was not a large town. It had a main street with the essentials. The trading post, run by a man named Cutter. The bank, which Victor Halstead operated, with the particular possessiveness of a man who confused ownership with power. A feed store, a small hotel, and a doctor's office that the doctor himself only occupied 3 days a week, since he covered 2 other settlements further east. The social order of the town was not complicated. There were people with money and people without it, and the line between the 2 categories had hardened over the past decade as the territory opened up and the men with capital moved in and started making decisions. Victor Halstead was at the top of that order. He was 51 years old, heavy-set in a way that suggested comfort rather than labor, with the expensive coat and the gold watch chain of a man who wanted you to take careful note of both. He had come to Red Hollow from somewhere back east 12 years ago, with enough money to buy the bank, and the understanding that in a frontier settlement, a man who controlled credit controlled everything. He'd been right about that. Over 12 years, he had extended that control with the patience of someone playing a very long game. He was in the trading post that morning because he enjoyed being seen in the trading post. It was a stage, and Victor had always understood the theater of public spaces. He talked to the men who mattered, let the others observe, and kept a running mental inventory of who owed him what and how that could be useful. He had not planned what happened with Mara Whitfield. It simply presented itself, the way opportunities often do for people who are always looking. Mara came in with Lydia and went directly to the dry goods counter, where Cutter's wife Edna was sorting through a new shipment of winter fabric. There were 3 other women at the counter: Helen Drummond, whose husband owned the feed store, and the Pierce sisters, who had married into 2 of the larger cattle operations north of town. These were not cruel women individually, but they were women who had grown comfortable in their position, and comfort of that kind creates a particular blindness. Helen Drummond noticed Lydia first. "Oh," she said, and the single syllable carried everything: the assessment, the conclusion, the mild disgust. She said it to the Pierce sisters rather than to Lydia, which was worse. A child can respond to something said directly at them. There is no response to being talked about, as if you're not present. "Is that the Whitfield girl?" one of the Pierce sisters said, not quietly. "Must be." Helen looked at the gray dress with the twice-repaired collar and the hem that had been let down so many times it was fraying. Poor thing. She didn't mean it kindly. Poor thing was a category, and the category meant beneath us, and children understand categories even when they don't know the word for it. Lydia's hand tightened on the edge of her mother's coat. Mara felt it. She kept her eyes on Edna Cutter and the fabric samples and said, "I need to check on the order I placed last month. The flannel." "Of course," Edna said. She was a decent woman who had not participated in what was happening behind Mara's back, but she wasn't stopping it either. There's a whole category of people who aren't cruel and aren't courageous, who occupy the middle space, with their decency mostly intact and their silence doing the necessary work for everyone else. "That collar," the other Pierce sister said, still not lowering her voice. "Has she had that same dress since before Thomas died, I think," Helen said. Victor heard this from across the room. He had been talking to Jonas Whitmore about cattle prices, but the conversation had reached a natural pause, and he had caught the thread of the women's exchange with the attentiveness of someone who is always listening for something he can use. He looked at Lydia. He looked at Mara. He looked at the $17 he knew she was carrying. He'd had his clerk check the balance of her tin box situation through a source he'd developed in the settlement, a small cruelty that he thought of as simply good business practice. And then the thing happened that would cost him everything, though he would not understand that until much later. He picked up his ledger from the counter where he'd set it while talking to Whitmore, and he crossed the room, and he made it a performance. "Mara," he said, pleasantly enough, "I was hoping to see you." She turned from the fabric counter. Her face had already assembled itself into the careful, neutral expression she'd been practicing. "Victor, I've been meaning to talk to you about your account." He opened the ledger to the page he wanted, the one he'd already turned to before he crossed the room, which told you something about the premeditation of it. "You're 3 months behind. I'm aware. $40 as of the 15th. He said it loud enough for the room. Not so loud it was obviously performative, but loud enough. "And I've been, I think you'd agree, very patient." "I have a payment," Mara said. $17. "I know it's not the full amount." 17, he let it land, out of 40. The room had gone quiet. This was the part that Victor enjoyed, not cruelty for its own sake, but the particular satisfaction of demonstrating the order of things, reminding people of who held the weight and who was held by it. He looked down at Lydia, and what crossed his face wasn't contempt exactly, but something adjacent, the assessment of a man looking at a problem and finding it beneath his effort. "That dress," he said. He said it quiet, but quiet is sometimes worse than loud. Lydia looked down at herself, at the gray wool that her mother had repaired and pressed and kept as clean as possible, at the collar that had been stitched 3 times, so carefully that you almost couldn't see it. She looked at herself through his eyes, which was the cruelest thing he did that morning, because she was 10 years old and didn't have the armor for it yet. Chin trembled once, then went still. Mara moved. Not dramatically, she didn't reach out, didn't make a scene, she simply shifted, so that her body was between Lydia and Victor, a small repositioning that any mother watching would have recognized immediately. "We'll manage the balance," Mara said. Her voice was even. "I'll have the rest by the end of the month." "The terms of your note specify the 15th, Victor said. "I know what the terms specify." "Then you know that $17 and a promise isn't a payment, Mara." Helen Drummond made a small sound. One of the Pierce sisters turned away. The room had the particular stillness of people who are uncomfortable and unwilling to say so. Mara's jaw was tight. She was thinking about Lydia standing behind her, about the way Lydia had gone quiet in the way she'd inherited from Thomas, and about the fact that she had exactly $17 in her coat pocket and 40 acres of land that she was beginning to suspect was worth less to her than it was to other people who hadn't explained their interest yet. She was also thinking, though she had no name for him, yet no reason to notice him, about the man near the fireplace, who had not moved since the conversation started, who was watching, whose stillness was so complete that it had begun to feel like something other than inattention. "I'll pay the 17 today," she said. "I'll have the rest before the month is out. That's what I can offer you." Victor looked at her for a moment. Then he closed the ledger, and his expression did the thing that was worse than anger. It went politely, conclusively indifferent. "We'll discuss it at the bank," he said. "Come in on Monday." He meant it as a dismissal, and everyone in the room understood it as one. He turned and walked back toward Jonas Whitmore without another word, leaving Mara standing at the dry goods counter in the middle of a room full of people who were very deliberately looking at other things. Lydia pressed against her mother's back. "Mama," she said so quietly that only Mara could hear it. "Can we go?" "In a minute." Mara's hands were shaking. Not visibly, she'd pressed them flat against the counter to keep them still. "Let me finish with Edna." Edna was already folding up the flannel samples, with the deliberate concentration of someone who had decided not to have witnessed anything. "The order's not in yet," she said. "Should be by Thursday." "Thank you," Mara said. She paid for a small amount of flour and dried beans with coins she counted out carefully, and then she put her hand on Lydia's shoulder, and they walked out of the trading post into the cold, and neither of them said anything for the first half block. Then Lydia said, "I don't care about the dress." She said it, the way children say things they absolutely care about, with the flatness of practiced denial. "I know," Mara said. "Helen Drummond's hat looks like a dead bird anyway." Mara made a sound that was almost a laugh, sharp and involuntary. She looked down at her daughter, this serious, stubborn, quietly fierce child who had Thomas's eyes and something else entirely that was all her own, and she felt, alongside the shame and the anger and the bone-deep exhaustion, something that was close to pride. "It does a little," Mara said. They walked. The wind had picked up coming from the northwest, carrying the particular smell of incoming snow. Mara was calculating the same equation she calculated every day: what they had, what they owed. What margin existed between those two numbers, and arriving at the same answer she always arrived at, was not enough. She did not see Elias Crow when she left the store. She had no reason to know he was behind them, standing in the doorway of the trading post, watching them walk down the frozen street with the steady attention of a man who has just decided something. She had no reason to know that he had heard every word spoken in that store from the moment he arrived. She had no reason to know that he was the kind of man who, when he decided something, generally followed through to the end, not because he was heroic, but because he was thorough, and because the thing he'd just witnessed had tripped a wire in him that he hadn't known was there. She did not know any of this. She knew she had $17, $40 of debt, a daughter with cold feet and more dignity than she had any right to at 10 years old, and a farm sitting on top of something she hadn't yet discovered. The snow started before they reached the edge of town. Back inside the trading post, Elias Crow set down his coffee cup, pulled on his coat, and said to no one in particular, "Who owns the Whitfield place?" Jonas Whitmore, standing nearby, looked up. "Mara Whitfield, widow." "Why? What do you know about the property?" Jonas shrugged. 40 acres, wheat ground. Nothing special. Halstead's bank holds the note on it. Elias looked out the window at the street where Mara and Lydia had disappeared into the gray morning. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, in the way of a man turning something over, examining it from different angles. "Nothing special," he repeated, mostly to himself. Then he asked Jonas if he knew where he could find a land surveyor still working in the territory. Jonas said there was one over in Billings. Elias said he'd need him by the end of the week, and he said it in the particular tone that made Jonas understand that this was not a request so much as an announcement of what was going to happen. Then he put on his hat and walked out into the snows. He didn't say what he was thinking. He rarely did. What he was thinking was this: 40 acres of flat Montana ground, with a widow woman barely holding on, a banker who was too interested in that specific note, and the unmistakable geography of a valley that he had, in the past 3 months, been studying very carefully for reasons that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the railroad survey. He'd been quietly financing out of his own pocket since last August. What he was thinking was that sometimes a man who controls information also controls outcomes. And Victor Halstead had just made the mistake of doing something stupid in front of someone who now had every reason to look very closely at what was actually happening with the Whitfield land. Snow kept falling. Elias Crow walked to his horse, untied the reins with the deliberate calm of a man who has decided that speed is less useful than accuracy, and rode east out of Red Hollow in the direction of the Whitfield property boundary. He wanted to see the land before dark. He wanted to see the creek. The land surveyor's name was Pemberton, and he arrived from Billings on a Thursday morning looking like a man who had spent 2 days on a stagecoach and was not pleased about it. He was thin, precise, the kind of man who carried his own instruments wrapped in oilcloth and got irritable when people touched them. Elias had arranged for him to stay at the Red Hollow Hotel and begin work the following morning, and Pemberton, after one look at the valley, had set his jaw in the particular way of a professional who has just recognized that the job is going to be more interesting than advertised. Elias did not go with him to the Whitfield property. He had reasons for keeping his distance that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with the fact that he had spent the past 4 days asking careful questions around Red Hollow, and the answers he was getting were making him want to move slowly and correctly rather than fast and wrong. What he had learned so far, Victor Halstead had held the Whitfield note for 14 months. The original terms, 10% annual interest on a loan of $220, were standard enough. What was not standard was the clause buried on page 3 of the contract, written in the compressed legal language that frontier banks used when they wanted something to be technically visible and functionally invisible. Clause allowed the bank to assess additional penalties for late payment at a rate determined by the bank's discretion, and to compound those penalties monthly. Mara's original debt of $220 had been managed barely, but managed through Thomas Whitfield's last 2 harvest seasons. When Thomas died, Mara had made 2 payments on her own before the winter crop failed due to early frost. She had been late on 1 payment by 11 days. Victor had assessed a discretionary penalty of 30% on the remaining balance. He had then compounded that penalty the following month when Mara, still recovering from Thomas's death and the failed crop, was late again. By Elias's calculation, roughly $60 of Mara's current debt was not debt at all. It was invention. Question was whether Victor knew what he was sitting on top of, or whether he was simply doing what opportunistic bankers do, squeezing what he could from a note that had gone soft without yet understanding the real value of the property. Elias suspected the former. Victor was not a stupid man. He was a careful man who moved slowly and covered his tracks, which in Elias's experience was more dangerous than stupid. He had his answer by Friday afternoon when Pemberton came back from the survey with mud on his boots and a look on his face that said everything before he said a word. They sat in the back room of the hotel, the surveyor's maps spread across the table, and Pemberton pointed with a dry finger at the creek line that cut across the southwest corner of the Whitfield property. "That's not a seasonal creek," Pemberton said. "That's a primary tributary of the Yellowstone watershed. Permanent flow, even in drought years, deeper than it looks from the bank." He paused. "And it sits directly at the junction point the Northern Pacific Survey identified for the branch line spur." Elias looked at the map. He already knew this. Roughly, it was why he'd wanted the survey confirmed before he moved. But seeing it drawn out in Pemberton's precise hand made it concrete in a way that changed the weight of everything. "The railroad needs that water source," Elias said. "Needs it or something very close to it. For the construction phase alone, you're looking at significant water demand. After that, for the maintenance depot they're planning." Pemberton folded his hands on the table. "Whoever holds the water rights on this property, when the spur goes through, is going to be in a very strong negotiating position. What's the property worth right now, on paper? As a wheat farm? Maybe $400, maybe less, given the debt situation." Pemberton looked at the map again. With the water rights and the railroad development, considerably more. "I wouldn't want to put a number on it until the spur route is finalized, but we are talking about a different order of magnitude." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Has anyone else commissioned a survey on this land recently?" Pemberton hesitated, which was itself an answer. "I'm not at liberty to say who my other clients are." "That's fair," Elias said. He leaned back in his chair. "But I'll ask you this. If another survey had been done in the past, say 6 months, would the results have been the same?" "Creek hasn't moved," Pemberton said dryly. "And the railroad survey was filed with the territorial office in August. Anyone who knew to look for it would have found it in August. Victor Halstead had known. Elias was certain of it now. Victor had known since August, possibly earlier, through whatever connections he maintained at the territorial office, and he had spent the months since then engineering a situation where Mara Whitfield's debt became unpayable, so that the bank could foreclose, so that Victor could acquire the property and the water rights that sat on top of a future that Mara didn't know was coming. the penalty clauses, the compounding interest, the public humiliation in the trading post designed to isolate Mara socially, to make it harder for her to find allies or credit from other sources. All of it deliberate, all of it patient and careful and thoroughly wrong. Elias paid Pemberton, told him the maps were his to keep, and went to find Mara Whitfield. She was not easy to find, which itself told him something. She was not in town. She rarely came to town more than once a week, because the 2-mile walk cost time she needed for other things. He rode out to the farm, in the late afternoon, when the light was going orange and flat across the valley, and found her in the small barn behind the house, working on the horse's thrown shoe with a hammer, and a look of an intense concentration that did not waver when he rode up. She looked up once, assessed him coat, horse, the fact that he wasn't someone she recognized, and went back to the shoe. "You're the man from the trading post," she said. He hadn't thought she'd noticed him. He revised his assessment of her upward. "Elias Crow," he said. "I have a ranch about 12 miles east of here." "I know who you are," she said. "Not unfriendly, just precise. What do you want?" He got down from his horse and tied the reins to the fence post and walked over, but he stopped far enough away that she'd have to make a deliberate choice to turn toward him. He wasn't going to crowd her. He understood already that this was a woman who had been crowded enough recently. "I want to talk to you about your property," he said. She set the hammer down slowly, turned to face him. Her expression was the one he'd seen in the trading post, carefully neutral, carefully held, but her eyes were different up close. There was something sharper in them, and more tired and less willing to pretend than her face was. "My property," she said. "Your land. The creek on the southwest corner." She said nothing, which meant she was listening. He told her about the railroad survey. He told her about the water rights and what the branch line development would mean for property in this specific part of the valley. He did not tell her yet what he'd discovered about Victor's penalty scheme, because he'd learned over many years that leading with too much information at once was a good way to lose people, even smart people, in the middle of it. Mara listened without interrupting. This was unusual enough that he noticed it. Most people, when you tell them their land is worth considerably more than they think, either get excited, suspicious. Mara got neither. She got still. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known this? About the survey? Since August. About your specific property being in the zone?" "I had it confirmed 2 days ago." "And Victor Halstead?" The question surprised him. He looked at her more carefully. "What makes you ask that?" "Because he's been very interested in that note for the past 3 months," she said. "And Victor Halstead is not a man who gets interested in things without a reason." She picked up the hammer again, not to use it, just something to hold. "He came out here himself in September. Said he wanted to inspect the property as collateral. Thought it was strange. He'd never done that before." "September," Elias said. That's consistent with when the survey was filed." He walked the whole boundary, took notes. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought he was looking for reasons to say the farm wasn't worth the debt. That's what I thought he was doing." "He was doing the opposite," Elias said. Her jaw tightened. Not dramatically, a small, controlled movement, like something clicking into place. "He knows what the creek is worth. He knows." She turned away from him and looked at the far fence line, at the bare winter fields beyond it, at the dark line of the creek cutting through the low ground in the southwest corner. She looked at it for a long moment. "I have $40 in debt," she said, "except it's not $40. I've been trying to figure out how it got to $40 since last spring when it was 26. Can't make it add up." She turned back. "Can you make it add up?" He told her about the penalty clause then. All of it as clearly as he could, translating the legal language into arithmetic. He watched her face as he talked. She didn't go pale or tearful. She went white around the mouth, which was different. That was anger, contained and precise and very cold. When he finished, she said, "Show me." He had brought a copy of the relevant contract language, which he'd obtained through means he didn't explain, and she didn't ask about. She read it standing there in the barn, with the horse shifting behind her and the light going, reading it twice with the focus of a woman who is converting rage into information. "This is legal?" she asked. "It's in the contract you signed. Whether it holds up if you contest it is a different question. Do I have grounds to contest it? Probably. The discretionary penalty clause in combination with the compounding structure might not withstand scrutiny from a territorial court, but that takes time and money you may not have. So what are you suggesting?" This was the question he'd been thinking about since Friday, when Pemberton laid out the maps. He'd turned it over from several angles, because he was not, by nature, a man who offered things without understanding his own reasons for offering them. He had money. He had connections. He had specific and detailed interest in the railroad development that ran through this valley, and that had, until 2 days ago, included the assumption that he might need to negotiate with whoever ended up controlling the Whitfield water rights. Finding out that whoever was Victor Halstead by way of fraud was not something he was willing to sit with, but he was also aware that he needed to be honest about what he wanted, because Mara Whitfield was not a woman who would tolerate being maneuvered, even by someone whose intentions were better than Victor's. "I want to pay off your note," he said. "The legitimate portion of it, what you actually owe, without the inflated penalties. I'd estimate that's somewhere around $160. Sitson stared at him. "That's charity." "No, it's a loan, at the same terms your original note carried. 10% 5 years. Except from me, the terms will be exactly what they say they are." "Why would you do that?" "Because I have an interest in this valley that is not compatible with Victor Halstead controlling water rights he obtained through fraud." He said it plainly, because she deserved plain. "I'm not doing this out of sentiment, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm doing it because it's the right strategic move, and because what he did is wrong, and those two things happen to point in the same direction." She looked at him for a long time. He did not try to fill the silence. "And what do you get?" she said. "I get a neighbor who isn't Victor Halstead owning property adjacent to a railroad development I'm invested in. That's worth more to me than $160. "It's not all of it," she said. He almost smiled. "No. I'd also want a conversation about the water rights. Not now, not until the railroad route is finalized. But down the road, when the development starts, I'd want to negotiate with you about shared access to the creek for the construction phase, for fair compensation. You want to buy the water rights. I want to negotiate for them, fairly, at a price set by mutual agreement and market value, not by whatever Victor would have paid himself after foreclosing." He paused, which would have been nothing, because you wouldn't have had any say in it. Mara set the hammer down on the fence rail and folded her arms, thinking. He could see her thinking, working through it the same way she'd been working through the debt arithmetic, looking for the error, looking for the hidden clause. "I need to think about it," she said. "That's fair, and I want to see whatever documents you have. All of them. The survey, the contract language, your loan terms in writing, before I agree to anything. I'll have them drawn up this week." She nodded once, the kind of nod that was not agreement but acknowledgement. "I've heard you. I'm not throwing you out. We'll see." He untied his horse and swung up, and she went back to the thrown shoe without another word. He was almost to the road when she called after him. "Mr. Crow." He turned. "Why were you in the trading post that morning?" she said. "You came to town for something. It wasn't to see me." "I came to see Cutter about a supply order," he said. "Did you get it sorted?" "I forgot about it," he said, which was the truth. Other things came up. She looked at him, that sharp, tired look. Then she turned back to the horse. He rode back toward town with the cold settling in around him, and the snow that had been threatening all day finally beginning to fall in light, indifferent curtains across the valley. He was thinking about the timeline. Victor's Monday meeting with Mara had not happened, yet today was Saturday. It meant Victor was planning to spend Monday applying more pressure, probably moving toward a formal notice of default. which meant Elias had approximately 48 hours to have his paperwork in order and his offer table in a form that Mara could act on before Victor moved. He pushed the horse a little harder. The following Monday morning, Mara walked into Victor Halstead's bank at 9 o'clock, which was when Victor had told her to come, and she sat down across from his desk with her hands folded in her lap and let him talk for 4 minutes about the terms of her default and the bank's options under the contract and the unfortunate but unavoidable necessity of beginning foreclosure proceedings, and then she slid a piece of paper across his desk. Victor looked down at it. It was a bank draft for $162.40, drawn on an account at the First Territorial Bank in Billings. Victor picked it up, looked at it more carefully, looked at Mara. "Where did you get this?" "It's a payment on my note," she said. "Full settlement of the legitimate outstanding balance. If you have questions about the calculation, I've attached a breakdown." She slid a second sheet across. "You'll notice the figure excludes the penalty assessments from months 3 and 4, which were applied under the discretionary clause in a manner that I believe doesn't hold up under territorial lending law. I've had that reviewed." Victor's face had done something complicated. During this speech, it had started with surprise and moved through a rapid sequence of calculations and landed somewhere that was not quite composed, but was working very hard to appear that way. He looked at the breakdown sheet. He looked at Mara. "You've had it reviewed," he said. "By who?" "By someone who knows territorial law," she said. She did not give him Elias's name. Not yet. There were reasons for that. Victor set both papers down on his desk with the careful deliberateness of a man deciding how much of his hand to show. He was thinking fast. She could see it in the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his fingers had gone very still on the desk surface. "This doesn't cover the full balance," he said. "It covers the actual balance. Penalties that comprise the difference are not enforceable as written." "That's your opinion." "It's an opinion I'm prepared to bring before the territorial court if necessary." She said it flatly. She had practiced this part. Her hands were not shaking. She had made very sure of that before she walked in. "I'd prefer we settle it today. I imagine you would too." Victor looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before. In all the months of managing this debt, of absorbing his condescension and his impatience and his performance of benevolent patience, wearing thin, she had never seen him look at her the way he was looking at her now, like she had rearranged into someone he needed to recalculate. "I'll need to review the documentation," he said finally. Of course. She stood, which surprised him. He'd expected her to wait for his permission to leave. "I'll expect a response by Wednesday. If I don't hear from you, I'll assume you'd prefer the court to sort it out." She picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "Good morning, Victor." She walked out of the bank into the cold air and stood on the boardwalk. For a moment, and her hands were shaking after all, not from fear, she realized, but from the particular physical cost of holding yourself together very tightly for a long time and then letting the tension out at once. She pressed them flat against her thighs until they stopped. She had 4 hours before Lydia would be home from the settlement schoolhouse. She went to the trading post and ordered the flannel she needed and paid for it with the remaining money from the tin box under the floorboard, which now had a different meaning than it had last week, not the last of things, but the beginning of a different arithmetic. She did not look at the dry goods counter, where Helen Drummond's crowd usually gathered, bought what she needed, and she left. Victor did not wait until Wednesday. He came to the farm Tuesday morning, earlier than was polite, and Mara saw him from the kitchen window riding up the road with his coat collar up against the wind, and the expression of a man who has spent 2 days deciding something and is not happy about what he's decided. She let him knock twice before she opened the door. "I'll accept the settlement," he said, without preamble, without the usual orchestration of dominance and patience. "Good," she said. "I'll send a courier for the signed release by Thursday." He stood there on her porch, in the cold for a moment, and she could see him wanting to say something else, could see the shape of it, the anger or the warning or the whatever. It was that he'd come out here, intending to leave her with some parting arrangement of words that would let him walk away, feeling like he'd kept something. But she didn't give him the space for it. She said, "Is there anything else?" in a tone that made it clear there wasn't, and after a moment he turned and went back to his horse. She watched him ride down the road until he was out of sight. Then she sat down at the kitchen table, which was not something she often did in the middle of the morning, and she sat there for quite a while without moving, with the empty room around her and the sound of the wind against the walls, and the particular silence of a house that had once had Thomas in it and now didn't. She had not cried much since he died. There had been too much to manage, but she cried a little now, not from sadness exactly, or not only from sadness, but from the compound pressure of 14 months of holding on releasing itself all at once into the quiet kitchen. She let it go. Then she wiped her face, stood up, and went to check on the horse. She had flannel to collect on Thursday and a loan agreement to review, and approximately 3 acres of land sitting on top of something that she was only beginning to understand. There was also, she realized as she pulled on her coat, the question of what Victor was going to do next. Because a man like Victor Halstead did not simply lose. He lost a particular battle, decided it was temporary, and started making adjustments. She had watched him long enough to know that. He had retreated from the bank confrontation with a composure that did not feel like acceptance. It felt like strategy, like a man who has been moved to a different board and is already counting pieces. What she didn't know, what neither she nor Elias knew yet, was that Victor had spent Tuesday evening in a meeting with 2 men who had arrived on the afternoon stage from Billings and checked into the Red Hollow Hotel under names that were not their own, Roan. She didn't know that one of these men had a copy of the county land plat and a working knowledge of how boundary surveys got filed and how, in certain situations and with the right paperwork, they could be amended. She didn't know that Victor had sat across from these men for 2 hours with a glass of whiskey and a very specific plan taking shape. She would find out, but not yet. That Thursday, Elias Crow came to the farm with a surveyor's copy of the land plat and a loan document drafted by a lawyer he'd brought up from Billings, and he sat across from Mara at the kitchen table while she read every page. She read it slowly, which he respected. She asked 3 questions, 2 of which were good ones that had required him to go back to the lawyer for clarification. He'd had the document amended before bringing it. "The water rights clause," she said. "This says we negotiate in good faith at market value when the railroad timeline is confirmed." "That's right. Who determines market value?" "An independent assessor, named in the contract." He pointed to the paragraph. "Not me. Not Victor. Not anyone with a stake in either direction." She read the paragraph twice. "That's fair," she said. "I want the right to walk away from the negotiation if the offer isn't satisfactory. It's in there, Section 4. She read Section 4. "That says I can decline the first offer. It says you can decline any offer that doesn't meet the assessed value within 15%. I want 10. He looked at her. 10%. "The margin should protect me, not give you room." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right, 10%. I'll have it amended by Monday." She nodded, closed the document, looked at him across the table with the same sharp, tired eyes that had looked at him in the barn, except they were a little less tired now. Not rested exactly, but different. "I want you to understand something," she said. "Tell me. I'm grateful for what you did. The information. The loan. That's it matters. And I know it." She said it without softness, which made it feel more genuine than softness would have. "But I need you to be clear with yourself that I'm not a problem you've solved. This land is mine. The decisions about it are mine. I'll work with you on the water rights because the terms are fair, and I'll repay the loan on the terms we've agreed to. And that's the shape of what we are." "I understand that," he said. "I don't think you fully do yet," she said, and there was no heat in it, just honesty. "But you will." He thought about saying something to that, and then thought better of it, which was the right call. He rode home that evening with the loan document in his coat and the amended water rights clause to be drafted, and the feeling unfamiliar enough that he took a moment to identify it that he had just had a more direct conversation about the terms of a business relationship than he'd had with anyone in several years, and that it had been useful. The snow that had been threatening since Monday finally came down properly that night, blanketing the valley in a clean, indifferent white that covered everything equally: the Whitfield farm and the Red Hollow Hotel and the bank building where Victor's office sat dark, and the road between all of them. Under that snow, the boundary markers stood where they had always stood, holding the property lines in place. For now. Because 30 miles east of Red Hollow, the two men from the billing stage were already on their way back with a set of documents that Victor believed would change the geometry of everything. And the plan they'd agreed to was not the kind that stops because one banknote has been settled. It was the kind that moves at night, when the snow is covering everything, and the valley is quiet, and the only people awake are the ones with something to hide. The boundary marker had stood in the southwest corner of the Whitfield property for 11 years. Thomas had set it himself. A cedar post sunk 2 feet into the ground with a flat stone beside it, carved with the survey coordinates, the kind of marker that a man puts in when he intends to stay. Mara knew exactly where it was. She had walked that fence line with Thomas the summer before Lydia was born, learning the edges of what was theirs, and she had walked it again, alone the previous spring, when the debt started feeling less like a manageable problem and more like something with teeth. The marker was still there on the Wednesday morning, after Victor accepted the settlement. She knew because she walked the line that morning, before Lydia was up, in the gray pre-dawn, cold with her breath coming in short clouds, and the snow from the night before crusted hard enough to hold her weight. She walked the whole southwest boundary, partly from habit and partly from the thing that had been sitting in her chest since Victor rode away from her porch, the feeling that a man who retreats that quietly is not retreating at all. Everything was where it should be. She told herself she was being careful, not paranoid, and went in to make breakfast. The documents from Elias came on Friday by courier, a young man from his ranch, who handed them over with a politeness that suggested Elias had given specific instructions about how to conduct the delivery. Mara read them at the kitchen table while Lydia was at school, with the deliberateness she brought to everything written that mattered. The amendments were there. 10%, not 15. The independent assessor clause was clarified. The repayment schedule was laid out in plain language, with no subclauses she couldn't follow. She signed them. She sent the courier back with the documents and a note that said, "Terms accepted, M. Whitfield." 6 words, because that was all that needed saying. What happened next did not happen immediately. It happened the way most dangerous things happen in winter, slowly, under cover, while everything on the surface looked frozen and still. The 2 men from Billings, whose names were not their own, had stayed in Red Hollow longer than one night. They had taken rooms at the hotel through the weekend and spent their days in ways that looked like ordinary travel eating at the hotel dining room, walking the main street, one of them spending an afternoon at the feed store talking about cattle prices with the patience of a man with nowhere particular to be. Nobody paid them much attention. Red Hollow was not a town that saw a lot of through traffic in January, but it saw some, and strangers in winter were not unusual enough to generate sustained curiosity. What they were actually doing, in the hours that didn't look like anything, was walking the Whitfield property line. Not once, 3 times. At different hours, in different weather, with instruments that they kept covered under their coats, until they were well clear of the road. They were measuring, and they were looking specifically at the boundary markers. The cedar post in the southwest corner was their primary interest. Mara didn't know any of this. She found out, as she found out most things, indirectly and slightly too late, to prevent what was already in motion. It was Edna Cutter who told her. Not because Edna was brave or particularly forthcoming, but because Edna had a practical streak that occasionally overcame her tendency toward silence, and because the things she'd seen had been unusual enough to bother her for 4 days before she decided to say something. She caught Mara at the trading post counter on the following Tuesday and said, in a low voice that was technically talking about the flannel order, "There were 2 men walking your south fence line last week, day afternoon. I saw them from my back window while I was airing out the storeroom. They had some kind of equipment." Mara kept her face still. What did they look like? Edna described them. Neither description matched anyone Mara knew. "Did you see where they came from? Or went?" "They came from the direction of the road and went back the same way. They had horses tied past the tree line." Edna's voice dropped further. "One of them was carrying a post digger." Mara bought her flannel and walked home faster than usual. She went straight to the southwest corner. The cedar post was still there. The flat stone with Thomas's carved coordinates was still there. Everything looked exactly as it should. She crouched down and looked at the ground, around the base of the post, and that was where she found a slight disturbance in the soil, to the east of the post, maybe 8 inches from the base, where the snow had been disturbed and resettled in a way that was almost invisible, but not quite, like something had been pushed into the ground and removed, or like someone had been testing the depth, gauging how the soil held. She stood up and looked east along the fence line, trying to calculate what 8 inches meant in terms of property. 8 inches at this corner would be. She did a rough calculation, in her head enough to shift the apparent boundary if the marker were moved, putting the creek on the wrong side of the line. Not immediately obvious. Not obviously wrong. Just wrong enough, with the right paperwork, to matter enormously when a railroad needed water rights, and someone needed to demonstrate that their land, not Mara's, sat adjacent to the creek. She went inside and wrote a letter to Elias. He arrived the following morning before she'd finished breakfast, which meant he'd ridden through the dark to get there, which meant he'd taken the letter seriously. He looked at the disturbed ground without touching it. He stood in the cold for a long time looking at it, and then he looked at Mara. "You need to document this before anything else changes," he said. "I know. Hal Pemberton's still in Billings. I can wire him today to come back out and resurvey the boundary. Creates a legal record, a time-stamped survey, that establishes where the markers are right now in their current position. How long will that take? 3-4 days for him to get here. Another day for the survey. That's almost a week." Yes. She looked at the disturbed ground, at the creek beyond it still running dark and open despite the cold, because it ran deep enough that it didn't fully freeze. What can they do in a week? If they move the marker before we have the survey documented, they file amended plat paperwork with the county office. The amended plat shows a different boundary. Challenging it after the fact is considerably harder than establishing the original first. She understood the race she was in. "Wire Pemberton," she said, "today." She also did something else that day, something she hadn't planned, and that took her longer to decide than she would have admitted. She went to the schoolhouse when Lydia came out at 3 o'clock, and she walked home with her daughter. And partway home, she said, "I need to tell you some things about the farm." Lydia looked up at her. "Is it bad?" "Some of it is complicated. I want you to understand what's happening, not just see the edges of it." They walked, and Mara told her not everything, not the legal details that would have meant nothing to a 10-year-old. The shape of it. Creek was valuable. Someone wanted it. They were trying to take it. Mara and Mr. Crow were trying to stop them. Lydia was quiet for a while. Then she said, "Mr. Halstead." "Yes." "I knew there was something wrong with him," Lydia said, not dramatically, just as a matter of record. "You did?" "He looks at people like he's counting them," the girl said. "Papa used to say that about certain men, that you can tell by how they look at you whether they're seeing a person or a number." Mara looked at her daughter walking beside her in the gray afternoon, with her breath clouding the cold air, and her braids slightly loose from the day, and her face carrying that seriousness that had always been entirely her own. Thomas had been right about many things. He'd also been right about Lydia, that she saw more than she said, and said less than she knew. "Keep your eyes open," Mara told her. If you see anything near the south fence line, anything that looks strange, you come find me immediately. Should I be scared? Mara thought about the honest answer versus the comfortable one. She went with honest. Be careful. There's a difference. Lydia nodded. She understood the difference. Pemberton arrived on Sunday. The weather had gone bad again on Saturday. Not heavy snow, but a driving sleet that coated everything in a thin, vicious layer of ice and dropped the temperature enough that breathing felt like work. He arrived in a bad mood that he improved somewhat by drinking 2 cups of coffee in Mara's kitchen before going anywhere, and then he went out and walked the south boundary with his instruments, and Elias beside him, and Mara watched from the kitchen window. They were out there for 2 hours. When they came back, Pemberton's expression was the same compressed professionalism he always carried, but there was something underneath it that Mara read as concern. He spread his notes on the kitchen table. The marker is in the correct position as of today, he said. I've documented it. Time-stamped, signed, witnessed by Mr. Crow. He pointed to the southwest corner on his diagram. However, Mara repeated. There is a second marker stake in the ground approximately 11 inches to the east of the cedar post. It's been driven in and then covered. The ground has been disturbed and then smoothed over. I found it with a probe rod. He looked up from his notes. It is not on the survey record. It is not on any recorded plat, but it is there. And it is positioned exactly where someone would drive a stake if they were preparing to argue that the recorded marker had been placed incorrectly and the true boundary was 11 inches to the east. The room was quiet. 11 inches, Elias said. 11 inches puts the creek outside your property line, Pemberton said to Mara. Approximately 3 feet. 3 feet. The margin between owning the water and not owning it. The margin between the railroad negotiation Elias had described and nothing. The margin between Mara's farm being worth what it was worth and being worth considerably less. 3 feet of frozen Montana ground. We pull the false stake, Elias said. If you pull it before it becomes part of any legal proceeding, there's no record they placed it, Pemberton said carefully, which is useful in one way and not in another. Explain. If they've already filed amended paperwork with the county office, the stake is evidence that the filing was fraudulent. If they haven't filed yet, pulling it removes the evidence of their intent, but also removes their ability to use it. He paused. Leave it. Document it. Photograph it if possible, and leave it. It is considerably more valuable as proof of what they were planning. Elias looked at Mara. She was staring at the diagram on the table. The 11 inches between the cedar post and the false stake. Creek line beyond both of them on the paper. How do we file the correct survey to protect the existing boundary? I file a boundary confirmation with the county land office in Billings. Today, if possible. It establishes a legal record of the current, correct marker position, signed and dated, before any competing filing can be submitted. Pemberton picked up his notes. I can ride to Billings tomorrow morning. Today, Mara said. The office is closed on Sunday. First thing tomorrow morning, then, before anything else opens. Pemberton looked at her, then at Elias. I'll need someone to ride with me in case the roads are bad. Take 2 of my men, Elias said. He said it without hesitation, which Mara noted. Not because it surprised her exactly, but because it registered the particular quality of someone who commits without making it a performance. Pemberton left within the hour to prepare for the early ride. Elias stayed. They sat at the kitchen table with the survey diagram between them and the sleet ticking against the window glass, and Mara made more coffee because it was cold, and her hands needed something to do. They're going to know we found it, she said. When the boundary confirmation gets filed, they'll know. Yes. What does Victor do when he knows his plan has been blocked? Elias wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He was quiet for a moment that was not avoidance but calculation. Victor is not a man who stops, he said. He adjusts. The false stake was one approach. When it fails, he'll look for another. Such as he could try to argue the original survey was flawed. That would require bribing or pressuring the county surveyor, which is harder but not impossible. You could try to find a different legal mechanism to challenge your ownership, some paperwork irregularity in the original deed. Something from when Thomas bought the property. Or he stopped. Or, she said, or he moves from legal maneuvering to something more direct. She looked at him. The men who came to survey your fence line, he said. They weren't locals. He brought them specifically for this. Men who work that way, who come in under false names and do what they were paid to do, they're not surveyors. The equipment was cover. You think he'd do something to the property itself. I think he's invested enough in this that he'll consider it. Elias set his cup down. I want to put 2 of my riders on your road, not inside your property line. I'm not suggesting you need guarding, but visible on the road so that anyone coming in the dark knows there's someone watching. Mara's first instinct was to say no. She was aware of the instinct and aware that it was partly pride and partly the genuine belief that accepting too much from Elias Crow came with a cost she hadn't fully calculated yet. She trusted his terms as written. She was less certain about the terms that weren't written. Every arrangement has unwritten terms. And she'd learned that from Thomas's experience with Victor Halstead. But she also thought about Lydia, asleep in the room down the hall, and the disturbed earth at the southwest corner, and the men with the equipment who had not been surveyors. On the road, she said. Not on my property. On the road, he agreed, and I want to know their names, he told her. She noted them. That night she lay awake for a long time listening to the sleet and the settling sounds of the house, and the quiet that was just quiet. No horses, no footsteps, nothing. The riders Elias had sent were out there somewhere on the road in the ice, which was a strange thing to think about, and she thought about it anyway. Men sitting in the cold in the dark to keep watch over a farm they had no connection to because another man had decided it mattered. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She filed it away. Pemberton made it to Billings the following morning before 11 o'clock and filed the boundary confirmation at the county land office at 11:17. He had Elias's 2 riders as witnesses to the filing. He also, on his own initiative, asked the clerk at the land office whether any amended plat documents had been submitted for the Whitfield property in the past 30 days. Clerk checked. None had been filed, which meant Victor's men had planted the stake but hadn't yet moved to the paperwork stage, which meant Pemberton's filing beat them by whatever margin had been left. When Elias got the telegraph message from Billings that afternoon, he rode to the Whitfield farm immediately. Mara read the message twice and handed it back without changing expression. Then she went to the stove and stood with her back to him for a moment, doing nothing in particular, and when she turned around, her eyes were slightly brighter than they'd been. Good, she said. It's not over, he said. I know, she went to the window, but it's something. It was something. It was also, as it turned out, the thing that pushed Victor Halstead from patience into the decision he'd been building toward for 3 weeks, the decision that abandoned the careful approach entirely. She found out how close she'd been to losing the race only later, when everything had already happened. And there was time to trace back the sequence. The amended plat filing had been prepared in Billings. It was dated for that Monday morning. The same morning, Pemberton rode to file the confirmation. The men who were supposed to deliver it to the county office had been delayed by the ice on the roads, not by much, not by hours, by approximately 40 minutes. Pemberton's confirmation had been stamped at 11:17. The competing filing arrived at 12:04. The clerk had looked at the competing document, noted the prior filing already on record, and flagged it as a conflict requiring resolution, which meant neither document was accepted without review. It meant the status of the boundary was legally contested, pending a hearing that would need to be scheduled. Contested, not resolved, not won. When Victor learned this on Monday afternoon, he understood what had happened and who had made it happen. He sat in his office with the telegram from his men in his hand for a long time. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a different kind of paper, not bank documents, not legal forms, but a plain sheet on which he had written, in his own hand, a list of names and numbers. He wrote one more line on it. Then he sent a message of his own. The message went to the two men at the hotel, who were still in Red Hollow, waiting. The message told them. The timeline had changed. The message told them to stop waiting. Mara did not know about this message. What she knew, on Tuesday morning, was that Lydia had gotten up early, which was unusual, and come to her room and said quietly, "Mom, there's a light near the south fence." Mara was out of bed before Lydia finished the sentence. She looked through the window and saw nothing. The south fence was far enough from the house that she couldn't see it clearly in the dark, just the black shapes of the fence posts against the slightly lighter dark of the snow-covered ground. No light. "Where exactly?" she said. "Near the corner post, the one with the stone." Mara pulled on her coat and boots in the dark, fast and quiet. She took Thomas's rifle down from the rack above the door. She kept it loaded, had always kept it loaded. Because a gun that isn't loaded when you need it isn't a gun, it's weight. And she looked at Lydia and said, "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone until I come back and knock 3 times. 3. Do you understand?" Lydia's face in the dark was serious and scared, and trying not to show the scared. 3 times. "You're all right. I'll be back." She went out through the back door into the dark and the cold, moving along the fence line rather than across the open ground, keeping low and close to the posts. Snow was crusty and loud, and she couldn't do anything about that, so she moved as fast as she could and hoped that the wind, which had picked up in the past hour, was covering the sound. She saw the light when she was halfway there. It was small and partially shielded, a lantern with the wick turned low and the glass mostly covered on 3 sides, the kind of setup you use when you need just enough light to see your hands without being seen yourself. There were 2 men. They were at the southwest corner, and one of them was working at the base of the cedar post with an implement she couldn't identify from this distance, but whose purpose she understood immediately. They were going to pull the marker and replace it with the false stake. In daylight, with Pemberton's filing already on record, this would accomplish nothing. The confirmation was filed, the boundary documented. She was not certain of this in the dark. She was certain of what she was seeing, which was 2 men on her property at 3 in the morning, trying to alter a boundary marker that had stood for 11 years, and the particular cold clarity that settled over her was not fear. It was the same thing she'd felt in Victor's bank, sitting across from him, while he explained her options. The same thing she'd felt walking the fence line the morning after he left her porch. A specific settled absence of the need to deliberate. She raised the rifle and put the first shot into the snow 3 feet in front of the man at the post. The sound of it in the winter dark was enormous. Both men scrambled upright. The lantern swung wildly, throwing light in all directions. "Next one isn't in the snow," Mara said. Her voice was level. Surprised her how level it was. "Step back from that post." Neither man moved immediately. They were doing what people do in the first seconds after something unexpected, recalculating, reassessing. Some looking for exits. "Step back now," she said, "or I demonstrate that I'm not practicing." One of the men stepped back. The other took a half step sideways, which was not the same as stepping back. And Mara fired the second shot into the post itself, not at the man, into the wood, 18 inches to his left, close enough that the impact shook the post and the splinters came off it in a direction he would have felt. Stepped back. "Hands where I can see them," she said. "Both of you." They were visible now in the swinging light from the dropped lantern. 2 men, both dressed for work rather than cold. One of them with a post-pulling iron in his hand that he dropped when she said hands visible. They were looking at the rifle and at her face, and doing, she suspected, the same calculation that Victor Halstead had done in the bank, reassessing, finding something they had not accounted for in their planning. Kept the rifle level and her breathing controlled, and she watched them, and she was thinking about how long it would take Elias's riders to hear the shots and come down from the road, and whether she could hold 2 men at gunpoint for however long that was, and whether she'd been right to send Lydia back inside, or whether the house was safer with Lydia in it, and whether the second shot had done something irreparable to the cedar post. And also underneath all of that, in the particular way that the mind keeps doing its work regardless of what the body is doing, whether Thomas would have thought this was stupid or brave, or whether he would have laughed at her for firing into a fence post. She thought he might have laughed, but approvingly. The sound of horses came from the north road, maybe 4 minutes after the first shot. It sounded like 2 horses, moving fast. The man who had been at the post tried to run when he heard it. He broke left toward the far fence, with the decision of someone who has decided that the rifle is a lesser risk than whatever's coming down the road. Mara tracked him but did not fire. He was running away from her, into the open field, not toward the house or toward Lydia, and she made the calculation in 1 second. Let him run. Hold the one still standing. She held the one still standing. He stood with his hands up and his eyes on the rifle until the 2 riders came through the gate at the south end of the property, and she called out to them in the dark. "I have one here." The other ran east across the field. One rider went after the second man. The other, his name was Garrett, she'd noted. It got off his horse and stood near the man with his hands up, with a solidity that communicated he would be staying there as long as required. Mara lowered the rifle. She had been holding it up for approximately 6 minutes. Her arms were shaking. She let them shake. "You all right?" Garrett said. "Yes." The shaking was already settling. "There's a post pulling iron in the snow over there. Don't touch it. Leave it for documentation." He looked at it, looked at her. "Yes, ma'am." She walked back to the house and knocked 3 times on the back door. Lydia opened it so fast that she must have been standing directly behind it. She looked at her mother's face and at the rifle, and at the state of Mara's coat, which had ice on the left shoulder from where she'd braced against the fence post, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Did you shoot anyone?" "No." "Did you shoot anything?" "Fence post." Lydia processed this. "Is the post all right?" "It's had better nights," Mara said. She went inside. She stood by the stove and let the warmth come back into her hands, and she waited for them to stop shaking. And Lydia sat across from her at the kitchen table and did not pretend to be going back to sleep, and they waited together for whatever the morning was going to bring. Garrett's partner caught the second man in the field, a quarter-mile east, his boots having broken through the ice crust twice in the running, and slowed him enough to be overtaken. Both men were held until Elias arrived at dawn, riding hard and arriving at the farm with the look of a man who had been awake since the first shot sound reached the road and had been moving since. He looked at the post-pulling iron still in the snow. He looked at the damaged cedar post. He looked at Mara standing in the doorway. "Were you hit?" "No." "Were they?" "No." He looked at the post again. "How many shots?" "2." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is adding information to a picture he is building. The writer said, "You held one at gunpoint for 6 minutes in the dark." "Closer to 7, she said. "I was counting." Something shifted in his face that was not quite a smile and was also not nothing. "The filing is on record," he said. "Whatever they moved or didn't move tonight, it doesn't change the legal boundary. I know that. So you didn't need to. They were on my property," she said. 3 in the morning. With equipment. She looked at him steadily. "What would you have done?" He was quiet for a moment. "The same thing," he said. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in. There's coffee." He came in. Elias sent word to the county sheriff by mid-morning, with Garrett as messenger, and the post-pulling iron wrapped in canvas as evidence. The 2 men, once they understood that the night's work had been witnessed, documented, and that the iron was already on its way to the sheriff, gave up the name of who had hired them with the speed of men who have decided that loyalty has a price, and this particular job had exceeded it. The name was not a surprise. But hearing it stated plainly in the front room of her own house, in the voice of a man who'd been sent to pull up her boundary markers in the dark, hearing it as fact rather than suspicion was different. Mara stood by the window and listened, and she looked out at the south fence line, where the cedar post still stood, damaged but standing, with the snow around its base disturbed, and the ice of the past weeks locked into the ground, and the creek still running dark and cold beyond it, going where it had always gone. Victor Halstead was going to have to answer for this. Question was where, and how, and who was going to be standing in the room when he did. The sheriff's name was Aldous Cray, and he had held the position in Red Hollow for 9 years through the particular combination of competence and stubbornness that frontier law enforcement required. He was not a man who moved fast, not because he was slow, but because he had learned early that speed in his profession was frequently the enemy of correctness, and correctness was the only thing that held in the long run. He arrived at the Whitfield farm by mid-morning with one deputy, and the expression of a man who had already heard more of this story than he was comfortable with. He looked at the post-pulling iron. He looked at the damaged cedar post. He looked at the false stake that Pemberton had documented and left in place, still sitting 11 inches east of the cedar post in the frozen ground where it had been driven. He listened to Mara describe the previous night in the same flat, sequential way she described everything, what time, what she saw, what she did, in what order. He listened to Garrett confirm it. He read Pemberton's survey documentation with the careful attention of a man who understood that he was going to be asked to testify about this eventually and wanted to have it straight. Then he sat at Mara's kitchen table with his hat on his knee and said, "The 2 men gave you Halstead's name." "They did," Elias said. He was standing near the window. He had been standing near windows all morning, which Mara had noted without saying anything about. "Hearsay until I talk to them myself," Cray said. "They're in Garrett's custody. I can have them here in an hour." Cray looked at Elias with the particular expression that Mara was coming to recognize as the look people gave Elias Crow when they were trying to determine how much of what he was doing was legitimate and how much of it was a powerful man substituting his own judgment for the laws. It was a fair thing to wonder. She wondered it herself sometimes. "I'll talk to them at the jail," Cray said. "Not here," he stood, put his hat back on, "and I'll need to talk to Halstead." "Before or after you talk to the 2 men?" Elias said. Cray looked at him. "In the order I decide." Elias said nothing, which was the right call. Mara could see him making it the small deliberate choice to step back, and she recognized it as something he was capable of but had to think about, which made it more credible than if it had come naturally. After Cray left with his deputy and the wrapped post-pulling iron, the farmhouse went quiet in the way. It went quiet after sustained activity, a kind of deflation, not unpleasant, but disorienting after the past several hours. Lydia was at school. Mara had insisted on it, which Lydia had argued against with the focused energy of a 10-year-old who felt she was missing something important. And Mara had said that missing school was not an option regardless of what was happening at the southwest corner of the property. And Lydia had gone, unconvinced but obedient. "He'll talk to Victor today," Elias said. He was still at the window. "Will Victor confess to anything?" "No. Victor will be very cooperative and very concerned and very clear that whatever those 2 men did, he had no knowledge of it and deeply regrets the distress caused to the Whitfield family." He said it without expression. "He's been preparing a version of that speech for some time, I imagine." Mara sat down at the table. Her back ached from the cold and the posture she'd held at the fence line, and she was tired in the way that comes not from physical work, but from sustained alertness, the kind of tired that doesn't respond to sleep immediately, that has to be waited out. "What does he actually risk?" she said, legally. Elias turned from the window. "If the 2 men hold to what they told you and testify that Halstead hired them, he risks a charge of criminal conspiracy to commit fraud, possibly tampering with official property records, depending on how the territorial prosecutor reads the false stake in connection with the competing plat filing." He paused. Competing plat was filed. That document exists. It was filed under names that aren't real, which is a separate problem for whoever signed it, but the connection to Victor would need to be demonstrated. Can it be demonstrated? The men know who paid them. Whether they're willing to say so in front of a judge is a different matter than saying so to you at 3 in the morning with a rifle pointed at their associate. He said it carefully, not as criticism, just as fact. Victor has money. Money makes people reconsider their testimony. Mara absorbed this, so the legal case may not hold completely. There may be enough to damage him without being enough to convict him. Frontier courts are inconsistent. She looked at the table. The survey documents still spread across it from Pemberton's work, the careful lines marking where her land was and where it wasn't, and the 11 inches that had almost been enough to change that. Then we need something else, she said. Yes. What do you have? He looked at her. What makes you think I have something? Because you've been standing at that window since Cray left, and you're not a man who stands at windows without a reason. She met his eyes. You've been thinking about what comes next, since before I sent you the letter about the stake. You came here with a plan the first time you rode out. You always have a plan. He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet this time, a different kind, that she didn't have a name for yet. The Northern Pacific Survey, he said. The one that identified this property's water source as critical to the branch line. That document was filed with the territorial office. It is a public record. He came away from the window and sat down across from her. What is not public is who was consulted during the survey planning phase, who provided input on route options, who had access to the preliminary findings before they were filed. She waited. Victor Halstead was on the Territorial Development Committee in August. Elias said, "It's a voluntary board, businessmen and landowners who advise on infrastructure projects in the territory. I was on it. Victor was on it. We sat in the same room in Helena when the preliminary railroad survey findings were presented. I watched him look at the maps. I watched him understand exactly what he was looking at. He knew before the filing. He knew 6 weeks before the filing was public. And within 3 weeks of that meeting, he had begun the process of engineering Mara Whitfield's debt into a crisis. He folded his hands on the table. I can document the committee meeting. I can document who attended and when the preliminary findings were presented. I have my own notes from that meeting that include the date and the agenda. If I provide those records to the territorial prosecutor, along with Pemberton's survey documentation and the competing plat filing and the testimony of the 2 men, even partial testimony, it establishes a timeline." Mara looked at him. "You've had this since the beginning. I've had the potential of it since the beginning. It becomes evidence when it's connected to everything else. Why didn't you lead with it?" He thought about the answer. She could see him deciding between the convenient version and the accurate one, because using it too early would have shown my hand to Victor before we had the rest of it assembled. If he knew I was connecting him to the committee meeting and the survey timing, he would have moved faster and more carefully. False stake, the competing plat, he was moving fast because he thought he still had time. If I'd shown the committee documentation first, he might have found a cleaner approach. She sat with that for a moment. Or he might have stopped entirely. He wouldn't have stopped. He'd invested too much in it. Mara thought about the men at the fence line, about the post pulling iron in the snow, about the fact that Victor had escalated from legal maneuvering to sending people onto her property in the dark, which was not the behavior of a man who had contingency plans. It was the behavior of a man who had started to feel the ground shifting and had made a panicked decision. "He's scared," she said. Elias looked at her. "Yes. Since the settlement. He didn't expect you to fight the penalties. Thought I'd just accept it." "He's always worked with people who accept it," Elias said. "The assumption that makes men like him possible." Observation landed between them without either of them pushing it further, because there was nothing more to say about it that the silence didn't already say. The next 3 days were the particular kind of tense that looks like stillness from the outside. Cray talked to the 2 men at the jail. He talked to Victor, who was, as Elias had predicted, cooperative and concerned, and entirely ignorant of anything the 2 men might have been doing at the Whitfield property line. He talked to Jonas Whitmore about the committee meeting in Helena, which confirmed Elias's account of who had attended. He sent a telegraph to the territorial office in Helena asking for the committee attendance records. Victor, meanwhile, retained a lawyer. The lawyer arrived from Billings on Thursday, a man named Fitch, who had a reputation for handling complicated situations and whose particular skill was making things that were straightforwardly wrong appear to be matters of reasonable interpretation. Fitch visited Cray and delivered a very precise argument that the two men at the property line had been acting without Victor's knowledge or authorization. The competing plat filing had been prepared by persons unknown who had apparently forged documentation, and that Victor Halstead was as troubled by these events as anyone and looked forward to cooperating fully with any official investigation. Cray listened. He was polite. He was also, Mara sensed from her one conversation with him during this period, not entirely persuaded, but uncertain about what he could actually do, given the shape of the evidence. She had that conversation on Thursday afternoon when Cray stopped by the farm to tell her what he could tell her, which was limited. The two men are holding to their statement that Halstead hired them, he said, but one of them is already talking to his own lawyer. The other one's gone quiet. He turned his hat in his hands. Plat filing the competing one was signed by a name that doesn't appear to correspond to any real person. That's a problem for whoever filed it, but connecting it to Halstead requires more than we currently have. What about the committee records? Mara said, requesting. Haven't arrived yet. How long? Week, maybe 2. Kept her face neutral. Victor's lawyer has been here 2 days. What's he doing while we wait for records? Cray looked at her with the expression of a man who appreciates the question and doesn't enjoy the answer. Pairing arguments, he said. That's what lawyers do. She walked him out to his horse. Before he mounted, she said, Sheriff, I want to ask you something directly. All right. Is Victor Halstead going to be held accountable for what he did? Not what he did at the fence line in January, what he did over the past 14 months. The penalty scheme, the engineered debt, the attempt to steal land he knew was worth considerably more than what he represented to me. Cray was quiet for a moment. The penalty scheme is a civil matter, not criminal. You'd need a territorial court and a lawyer of your own. He paused. The rest of it, the fence line, the plat, filing if the evidence holds, there are criminal charges possible. Whether they stick depends on things I can't predict. It's not an answer, she said. No, he said, with the honesty of a man who knows it. It's not. He mounted, settled into the saddle. I'll tell you this, I've been sheriff here 9 years. I know what Victor Halstead has done to people in this county. I know more of it than you might think. He looked at her from the height of the horse, with something in his eyes that was not a promise, but was also not nothing. I intend to be very thorough. He rode away. Mara went inside. She sat at the table and wrote a letter to a lawyer in Billings, whose name Elias had given her, not Elias's own lawyer, a different one, because she wanted someone who represented her interests and not a shared arrangement with a man whose interests, however aligned, were not identical to hers. She described the penalty scheme in detail, with figures. She asked for a consultation on whether the contract clause held up under territorial lending law and what her options were. She sent the letter with Garrett, who had become a semi-permanent fixture at the end of her road and who ran errands, with the uncomplaining efficiency of someone who had decided this posting was more interesting than his usual work. The reply came within a week. The lawyer's name was Harmon. He wrote back that on preliminary reading, the discretionary penalty clause, as applied, was likely unenforceable, and that she had reasonable grounds for a civil action to recover the excess charged. He asked for the original contract documents to review. He also noted that if criminal charges against Halstead moved forward in a connected matter, any civil action would likely benefit from the additional evidence generated by those proceedings. Mara read this letter 3 times. Then she wrote back, sent the contract documents, and authorized Harmon to begin preparation. She told Elias about it that Saturday. When he came by to check on the property, he was still having riders pass the road twice daily, which she had not asked him to stop, because the practical value outweighed the complicated feeling it generated. She told him she'd retained Harmon. She told him she was pursuing the civil case independent of whatever the criminal investigation produced. Elias listened. He nodded. He did not say anything about it that could be construed as either approval or concern, which she appreciated. Committee records came to Cray yesterday, he said. Helena confirmed the attendance roster and the date. Victor was listed. Present for the full session, including the portion where the Whitfield Creek was identified by the survey team as the critical water source for the spur. He paused. Cray has the timeline now. 6 weeks between that meeting and the first inflated penalty on your note. Thought about that. 6 weeks of Victor sitting on that information, looking at the numbers, deciding what to do about it. 6 weeks of her managing the farm and the debt, and Lydia, completely unaware that anyone was studying her property with specific intent. What does Cray do with it? She said. He's presenting the full file to the territorial prosecutor next week, in Helena. Elias was quiet for a moment. I'm going to Helena. She looked at him. Why? Because I was at that committee meeting. My testimony about what was presented and who was present is direct evidence, not circumstantial. And because he started again. Because I have a relationship with the Northern Pacific Development Office. That means when I say Victor Halstead attempted to defraud his way into controlling a water source they're depending on, people in that office are going to listen. You're going to apply pressure, she said. I'm going to provide information, he said, with the slight dryness of a man who knows the distinction is meaningful and also limited. What people do with it is their business. Thought about the versions of this Elias Crow in Helena, talking to railroad men and territorial prosecutors, a powerful man using his connections to protect an outcome he had an interest in, which also happened to be the right outcome. He thought about how much of what was right in the world happened because powerful people found it convenient, and whether that made the rightness less real or just more contingent. She didn't resolve it. She shelved it. The way she shelved things she couldn't act on immediately. Go to Helena, she said, and come back and tell me what happened. He left on Monday morning. He was gone for 4 days. In those 4 days, Red Hollow did the thing that small towns do when a situation has been building below the surface long enough it surfaced. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that water finds a crack and slowly, persistently, makes it larger. Talked. The story of Mara Whitfield's fence line had spread through the settlement the same day Cray arrived, because Garrett was known to people who knew other people, and the image of a widow holding 2 men at rifle point in the dark had a quality that was not easy to keep quiet. The trading post was where Mara felt it most directly. Stians. She went on Wednesday for supplies and found a different quality of attention than she was used to. Not warmth, exactly. Red Hollow didn't turn on a dime. But the particular shift that happens when people who were comfortable in their indifference suddenly need to recalculate. Edna Cutter was more directly friendly than she'd been in 14 months. Jonas Whitmore, who had always been civil, stopped her outside and said, without preamble, I heard about the fence line. Good on you. 2 women she barely knew nodded at her in a way that was deliberate rather than automatic. Helen Drummond was in the trading post. Mara saw her at the fabric counter and felt the old instinctive, bracing the preparation for the assessment, the ranking, the particular cruelty of women who enforce social hierarchy with the efficiency of people who've never questioned whether they should. But Helen looked at her and looked away quickly, which was its own kind of information. Mara bought her supplies. She did not perform anything. She did not meet anyone's eyes with particular significance, or carry herself with the conscious dignity of someone who knows they're being watched. She was tired and her back still ached, and she had flour and salt pork to get home before the afternoon cold settled in, and that was what she was focused on. But she noticed. She noted every shift and recalibration in the room, filed it quietly, and went home. Victor Halstead had not left Red Hollow. This surprised her, and also, when she thought about it, didn't. He had spent 12 years building his position in this town. Leaving before he was forced to would be an admission, and Victor was not built for admissions. He was at his bank every day. He appeared at his usual table at the hotel dining room for dinner. He spoke to people who spoke to him with the composed confidence of a man who is waiting for things to resolve in his favor and has decided that the best strategy is visible normalcy. Mara encountered him once on Thursday on the main street outside the bank. They were going in opposite directions, and there was no way to avoid the moment without making it a thing, so neither of them avoided it. Stopped. 4 feet of frozen boardwalk between them. Victor looked at her with the expression she'd spent a year interpreting the composed assessment, the slight condescension, and she looked at him. And what she felt was simpler and less heated than she expected. Not triumph, not anger, or not primarily. Something quieter. The recognition of a man who has overplayed a hand and knows it, but hasn't said so yet. Mara, he said. Victor. A pause that was neither comfortable nor dramatic. Just 2 people who had been on opposite sides of something for a long time, standing on a boardwalk in the cold. I hope things settle down out at your place, he said. And she understood the careful construction of the sentence, the passive voice of things settle down, the complete absence of agency, as if the events of the past weeks were weather that had happened to everyone equally. They will, she said, one way or another. She walked past him. She did not look back. Elias returned from Helena on Friday morning. He came to the farm directly from the road, still in his traveling coat, and sat down in the kitchen with a tiredness that was different from his usual careful composure, the tiredness of someone who has spent 4 days talking and maneuvering and holding multiple things steady at once. Told her what had happened. The territorial prosecutor had reviewed the full file. The committee records the survey documentation, Pemberton's boundary confirmation, the competing plat filing with its false signatures, the testimony of the 2 men, the post-pulling iron. He had listened to Elias's direct account of the Helena committee meeting and the timeline. He's going to file charges, Elias said. Criminal conspiracy to commit land fraud, tampering with official records, and trespass with criminal intent. He paused. The prosecutor also referred the penalty scheme to the Territorial Banking Commissioner for review. Mara looked at him. The banking commissioner. There's a regulatory dimension to the penalty clause that goes beyond your civil case. If the commissioner finds that Victor applied the clause systematically to more than one debtor, it becomes a regulatory violation with different consequences. He looked at his hands on the table. I gave the prosecutor names of 3 other families in the county who hold notes with Victor's bank. He's going to look at their accounts. She was quiet for a moment. You didn't tell me you were doing that. Didn't know until I was in the room, he said. Prosecutor asked if I knew of other cases. I told him what I'd heard. I should have told you I was going to do that before I went. She looked at him. The acknowledgement was cleanly given, no qualification attached to it, no explanation that was also an excuse. Yes, she said. You should have, you're right. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was honest. She appreciated honest more than comfortable. What happens now? She said. Cray will arrest Victor on the criminal charges when the paperwork arrives from Helena, probably early next week. He looked up. Fitch Victor's lawyer will fight it. There'll be a hearing before the charges go to trial. It could take months in the civil case. Your case with Harmon is independent. It can proceed regardless of the criminal timeline. He paused. Evidence from the criminal proceedings will support it significantly. Mara stood up and went to the window. Outside, the late afternoon light was going the particular pale gold of Montana winter, flat and cold and very clear. The south fence line was visible from here, and the cedar post in the corner, still standing with its crack from the rifle shot that had splintered the wood and the churned ground around its base from 3 sets of boots and 2 sets of instruments. He's going to fight every piece of this, she said. He is. It's going to be ugly before it's done. Yes. She turned back from the window. Her face was not resolved. Exactly, resolution was too clean a word for what it was. It was more like the expression of a person who has looked at the distance they have to walk and decided to start walking since. "Tell me about the hearing," she said. "Everything you know about how it works and what I'll need to do," he told her. She listened. She asked questions. He answered them. Outside the window, the light went from pale gold to gray to the early dark of a January evening in Montana, and the fire in the stove settled and needed another log, and Mara got up and fed it without breaking the conversation. She was still asking questions when Lydia came home from the schoolhouse at 4:30, stamping snow off her boots at the back door with the particular energy of a child who has been confined all day and is ready for the world to be larger again. She came into the kitchen and looked at the two adults at the table, and at the papers between them, and at the expressions on their faces. "Is it good or bad?" she said, pulling her coat off. Mara looked at her daughter, at the serious face and the loose braid, and the boots that still didn't fit properly, and the eyes that saw more than they said. "Complicated," Mara said, "but it's moving." Lydia considered this with the pragmatism she'd inherited from both parents. "Is Mr. Crow staying for supper?" "I wasn't invited," Elias said. Lydia looked at her mother. "He can stay," Mara said, not warmly, not reluctantly, the way she said things that were simply true. Lydia hung up her coat and went to the stove, and the kitchen filled with the small sounds of an ordinary evening, the fire, the pot, the wind outside, and Mara sat across from Elias Crow with the papers between them and the long road ahead still ahead, and for the first time in 14 months, the arithmetic of where they stood did not come up short. It did not come up easy either. But short and easy were not the same thing, and she had learned the difference the hard way, and she was not going to forget it. The arrest happened on a Tuesday. Cray came with his deputy and the paperwork from Helena just after 9 in the morning, when Victor Halstead was already at his desk in the bank, with his coat hung on the rack behind him and his ledger open, performing the ordinary rhythms of a man who has decided that normalcy is his best defense. Fitch, his lawyer, had been warned it was coming, had in fact spent the previous week preparing arguments for the preliminary hearing, but knowing something is coming and experiencing it are different things, and the expression on Victor's face when Cray came through the bank door was the expression of a man who had understood intellectually that this was possible and was now discovering that understanding something intellectually is very far from being ready for it. He did not resist. He was not the kind of man who resisted in ways that were visible. He put on his coat when Cray told him to put on his coat, and he said he wanted to send a message to Fitch, and Cray said he could do that from the jail. And Victor looked around his office with the particular attention of a man trying to memorize something, and then he walked out. The main street of Red Hollow was not crowded at 9 in the morning in January, but it was not empty either. Enough people saw. Enough people were in the trading post window and the hotel doorway and paused on the boardwalk with their breath making small clouds in the cold. The story moved through the town by noon, the way stories move through small places not all at once, but in overlapping rings, each person adding the layer of what they'd seen or heard or inferred, until by the time Mara got word of it in the early afternoon, the version that reached her had the approximate shape of the truth, even if some of the edges had shifted. Garrett brought her the news. She was in the small barn, working on a harness repair that had been waiting 3 weeks for her attention, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and from his expression she knew before he said anything. "Done?" she said. "This morning." He went quiet, didn't make a scene. She nodded, went back to the harness for a moment, then set it down because her hands had made 2 mistakes in the last 30 seconds, and she was not going to ruin the leather because she couldn't focus. She stood up and brushed the dust off her coat and looked out the barn door at the sky, which was the flat pale gray of a Montana winter afternoon, with nothing particular to say for itself. She had expected to feel something cleaner than what she actually felt. Relief, maybe, or the particular satisfaction of a wrong thing being named as wrong in an official way. Felt, was complicated and tired and more subdued than she'd anticipated. Like the end of a long argument that you've been right about the entire time, which should be satisfying, but mostly just leaves you aware of how much of yourself you spent on it. "Thank you, Garrett," she said. He nodded and left, and she stood in the barn a little longer before going inside. Preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Harmon, her lawyer, came up from Billings the following week and sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 hours going over the civil case. He was a spare, methodical man who reminded her a little of Pemberton in his precision and who delivered information with the same compressed efficiency. "This is what we have. This is what it establishes. This is where it's weak. This is what I need from you." She liked him for the same reason she'd liked Pemberton. He did not explain things in a way that suggested she might not understand them. The civil case was straightforward in its facts and complicated in its timeline. Penalty clause recovery, the money Victor had extracted above the actual debt, was the cleanest piece, and Harmon believed they had strong grounds. The broader claim for damages related to the systematic pressure campaign and the emotional and financial cost of the past 14 months was harder to quantify and harder to prove in a way a court would accept. "Banking Commissioner's investigation helps you significantly," Harmon said. He had a notepad covered in small, precise handwriting that he occasionally consulted and more often didn't need to. "The commissioner finds that the penalty scheme was applied to multiple debtors, which initial indications suggest is likely it establishes a pattern. Pattern is considerably more useful than a single instance." "How long does the commissioner's investigation take?" "Months, possibly. These things run on their own timeline." He looked at his notes. "However, the criminal case may resolve faster, and any conviction on the fraud charges creates evidentiary advantages for the civil action that I won't have to work as hard for. And if the criminal case doesn't result in a conviction, we proceed anyway. The criminal standard is higher than the civil standard. What isn't provable beyond reasonable doubt may still be provable by preponderance of evidence." He looked up. "I want to be honest with you. Victor Halstead has a capable lawyer and resources. This is not going to be fast or easy, but the foundation of your case is solid. I wouldn't have taken it if I thought otherwise." She appreciated that. The no-promises version of confidence was more useful than the other kind. She made him a cup of coffee before he left and asked him, partly out of curiosity, and partly because she'd been thinking about it since the arrest, "Have you handled cases against Victor Halstead before?" Harmon looked at her over his coffee cup. "I've handled cases on behalf of people who were in situations created by Victor Halstead," he said carefully. "I've never had the opportunity to take a case against him directly." He's been careful. He paused. "Until now. Until a woman in a gray dress walked into a trading post with her daughter, and a man near the fireplace paid attention. Until the particular collision of Victor's greed and Mara's stubbornness and Elias Crow's specific interests had produced a situation that was harder to manage quietly than Victor had calculated. The preliminary hearing was held in the county courthouse in a town 30 miles south, which was the nearest place with a proper courtroom. Mara rode down with Elias in his wagon, a decision she'd made practically because she didn't have a reliable horse for that distance in winter, and because the conversation during the ride was preferable to silence in either direction, and because she had stopped pretending that the arrangement between them was simpler than it was. It was not a romance. She was clear on that. She was 34 years old and 14 months out of a marriage that had been genuinely good, and she was not interested in replacing Thomas or in allowing any man, however decent, to become another variable in an equation she was still working to control. But it was also not nothing the thing between her and Elias Crow. Particular regard of two people who had been through something significant together and come out of it with a specific understanding of who the other person was. That was real. It didn't require a name. She thought Thomas would have understood it. He had been the kind of man who didn't need things to be simple in order to accept them, which was one of the things she had loved about him And one of the things she still missed with a steadiness that surprised her, not in its presence, but in how ordinary it had become, part of the weather of her life rather than a crisis. The hearing lasted most of a day. Fitch made his arguments with the fluid competence of a man who has done this many times, and the territorial prosecutor laid out the evidence with the careful patience of someone who knows the document trail is his strongest ground and is content to walk the court through it step by step. Mara sat in the gallery and watched and listened and held herself very still. Victor sat at the defendant's table throughout, with the composed attention of someone who has prepared himself for this and is not going to give anything away through his posture or his face. He looked at several points, like a man presiding over a meeting he finds mildly tedious, rather than a man whose liberty was under discussion. She did not know if it was genuine composure or performance. Both were possible with Victor. She had never been entirely certain where his calculations ended and his actual emotions began, or whether the distinction was meaningful. He looked at her once. Across the courtroom, when the prosecutor was citing the committee meeting and the timeline of the penalty increases, Victor turned his head and found her in the gallery with the directness of someone who knows exactly where the person they're looking for is sitting. He held it for a moment, not long, not dramatically, and what she read in it was not what she expected. Not contempt, which was what she would have predicted. Something more complicated. The look of a man who has looked at his own situation clearly enough to see that he miscalculated, and who is deciding, in real time, how to carry that. She looked back at him without moving. He looked away first. The judge, a man named Dryden, who had the weathered patience of someone who had been hearing frontier disputes for 20 years, ordered the charges to stand and the case to proceed to trial, which would be scheduled for the spring term. He also ordered Victor to surrender his passport and remain in the territory pending trial, which Fitch accepted with the demeanor of someone who had expected worse, and was prepared to call this a partial victory. On the ride back to Red Hollow, Elias was quiet for the first several miles, which she had learned was how he processed things rather than a signal of something wrong. Spring term, he said eventually. March or April, she said. Does that work for you? With the farm? She thought about the spring planting calendar, about the wheat that needed to go in by mid-April, about the fence repairs that had been deferred since fall, and the barn roof that had 2 boards that wouldn't last another heavy snow, about Lydia, who would be 11 in March, and had asked 3 days ago whether they could get a dog, which was the kind of question that indicated a child who was feeling stable enough to want things. It works, she said. I'd rather it were sooner, but it works. He nodded. The horses moved at a steady pace, and the cold was the settled, windless cold of late January. Not mean, but simply present, and the road stretched out white and flat in front of them. I want to ask you something, she said. All right, the railroad. When the spur route is finalized, how long before they start the construction phase? The route should be confirmed by late spring. Construction would start that summer if funding holds, which I believe it will. He glanced at her. Why? Because I need to know how to plan the next 2 years. The civil case, the loan repayment, the water rights negotiation, they all overlap, and I want to understand the sequence. She was looking at the road ahead. I don't want to be reacting to each thing as it comes. I want to see the whole shape of it. What do you need from me to see the shape of it? I need you to be honest with me about the railroad timeline, including if it changes, and about your own interest in the water rights negotiation, not the version you'd present in a business meeting, the actual version. He was quiet for a moment. The wagon wheels made a slow crunching sound over the packed snow. Actual version, he said, is that I need the creek access for the construction phase, and I'm willing to pay a fair price for it because it's cheaper than the alternative. The alternative being building a water transport system from the next nearest source, which is 14 miles east, and would add significant cost to the construction budget. He paused. I have an interest in this being resolved smoothly and quickly. which means I'm not going to drag the negotiation or lowball you, because neither of those serves me. What does fair price mean? In figures, I'd want Pemberton to do a formal water rights assessment before I quoted a number. But my estimate, based on what comparable access has sold for on other railroad projects in the territory, is somewhere between $800 and $1,200 for the construction phase access rights. Ongoing access for the maintenance depot would be a separate, longer-term arrangement. Mara did the arithmetic in her head, $800 at the low end, against a loan balance of $160, against the civil case recovery, which Harmon estimated at $60 to $80 in penalty repayment, with the broader damages uncertain, against the farm, which produced enough in a good year to pay itself and set aside $50, and which sat on top of water that was worth more than everything else combined. The arithmetic looked different than it had 14 months ago. Not easy, she was wary of easy, had learned to be wary of it, but different in kind. The difference between a problem with no solution and a problem with a difficult one. Get Pemberton to do the assessment, she said. When we have the number, we negotiate. Agreed, he said. They rode the rest of the way into Red Hollow without talking much, but it was the specific quiet of two people who have said what needs saying and don't need to fill the space around it. The weeks between the preliminary hearing and the spring trial were not quiet. They had a specific quality of suspended activity, things happening steadily, below the surface, in lawyers' offices and the Territorial Banking Commissioner's investigation and the slow machinery of the county court system. Fitch filed 3 separate motions, attempting to have charges reduced or dismissed. Prosecutor responded to each. Dryden ruled on them with the steady patience he brought to everything, denying all 3. The Banking Commissioner's report landed in late February. It found that Victor Halstead's bank had applied the discretionary penalty clause to 11 accounts over a 6-year period, in every case resulting in debt inflation that bore no relationship to actual losses incurred by the bank. 3 of those accounts had resulted in foreclosure. The report recommended regulatory action and referred the findings to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for consideration in the existing criminal case. Harmon sent Mara a copy with a note at the bottom in his precise handwriting. This changes the civil picture significantly. Call this development very favorable. She read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning, with Lydia eating breakfast across from her. And she read it twice. And then she put it down and looked at the wall for a moment. Good news? Lydia said. She had gotten very good at reading her mother's silences. Yes, Mara said, good news. About Victor Halstead? About the case. Lydia chewed her toast with the considered expression she brought to things that were important to her. She was 11 now, as of 2 weeks ago. She had gotten the dog a border collie mix of uncertain parentage that she had named Biscuit with the absolute confidence of someone who has had the name ready for months. Biscuit was currently asleep under the table with his chin on Lydia's foot. Is he going to go to jail? She asked. I don't know, Mara said. That depends on the trial. But something will happen to him. Something is already happening to him. Mara looked at her daughter. He lost the bank. This was true. The Banking Commissioner's investigation had recommended the suspension of Victor's operating license pending the outcome of the criminal proceedings. 2 days after the report was issued, the Territorial Banking Authority had placed the Red Hollow Bank under administrative oversight. Victor was no longer making decisions about anyone's account. He was not technically operating the bank at all. A manager had been brought in from Billings to run it in the interim, a quiet man who had the demeanor of someone sent to clean up a mess and intended to do exactly that and nothing more. Victor was still in Red Hollow. He was staying at the hotel, which was a strange inversion of the order of things, the man who had wielded more power in this town than almost anyone else. For 12 years now, occupying a hotel room and eating at the hotel dining table, with the careful composure of someone who has decided that he is not going to appear diminished. He walked the main street. He spoke to the people who still spoke to him. there were some. Power that has been present for 12 years doesn't evaporate in 2 months, and there were men in Red Hollow who owed Victor Halstead for loans that had been given and favors that had been extended, and those men kept up the civil relationship because they were not yet certain which way things were going to land. The social mathematics of a small town are not straightforward, and Mara did not have the energy to track them precisely. What she tracked was her own work, her own case, and her daughter. The trial started on a Thursday in late March, when the first real thaw of the year had turned the roads to mud, and the horses had to work harder than usual, and the courthouse 30 miles south smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, and the particular damp of a building full of people in wet coats. 4 days. Mara testified on the second day. She had prepared with Harmon separately from the criminal case. Her testimony was as a witness to the penalty scheme and to the events at the property line, not as the prosecuting party, but she had also prepared herself in the way. She prepared for everything that required sustained composure by sitting with it alone the night before until the shaking that she'd learned to expect was gone. She was on the stand for almost 2 hours. The prosecutor walked her through the timeline. The contract signing, the escalating penalties, the meeting in the bank where she'd slid the payment document across Victor's desk, the letter to Harmon, the conversation with Elias that had started on a February afternoon in her barn was factual. She was not tearful, which she had worried about, not because tears were a weakness, but because she did not trust herself to be coherent through them, and she needed to be coherent. Fitch cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He was skilled. He looked for inconsistencies in the timeline, found a few minor ones that she corrected without defensiveness, and pushed on the question of whether she had understood the contract she signed. It was a reasonable question, and she gave it a reasonable answer. She had signed a contract she didn't fully understand because she was 33 years old, and 4 days passed burying her husband, and she had trusted that the document said what she had been told it said. That trust had been misplaced. That was the fact of it. Fitch let it go. Elias testified on the third day. He was on the stand for 3 hours, the longest single testimony of the trial, because the committee meeting and the timeline were the most complex and most damaging pieces of the prosecution's case, and Fitch worked hard at it. He questioned the clarity of the committee presentation, the degree to which any individual attendee could have absorbed specific property information from a broad survey overview, and whether Elias's account of what Victor had understood at that meeting was his interpretation rather than documented fact. Elias answered with the patience of a man who has no reason to embellish, because the facts are sufficient. He was not a hostile witness, and he was not a soft one. He said what he had seen. When Fitch suggested his memory was selective, or his interpretation of Victor's response to the survey data was inferential, Elias agreed that it was inferential and explained why the inference was sound, and then explained it again in different terms when Fitch pushed back, and continued doing this with the steady, unemotional persistence of water against stone. By the third hour, the jury had the look of people who had been given a large quantity of information and were arranging it into a picture. The picture was not flattering to Victor Halstead. Verdict came on the fourth day, late afternoon, when the light through the courthouse windows was going long and orange, and the room smelled of the same wet wool it had smelled of for 4 days. The jury had been out for most of the day. When they came back, their foreman was a rancher from the north of the county, whose name Mara did not know, and whose face gave nothing away. Guilty on the charge of criminal conspiracy to commit land fraud. Guilty on the charge of tampering with official records. Guilty on the charge of trespass with criminal intent. Not guilty on a fourth charge related to the false plat filing, where the direct connection to Victor rather than his hired men hadn't held firmly enough under the criminal standard. 3 of 4. Mara sat in the gallery and heard the verdicts read and felt not triumph. She had decided she was not going to perform triumph if it came the same quiet, subdued thing she had felt on the morning of the arrest. Rightness recognized. A thing that had been wrong named as wrong, in a room full of people with the official weight of the law behind the naming. Victor sat at the defendant's table throughout. He turned his head slightly at the first guilty, and then he was very still for the rest of them. And when Dryden called for sentencing to be scheduled, Fitch stood and immediately began his arguments about mitigating factors and Victor's years of contribution to the community, and Dryden listened with the patience of a man who has been doing this long enough to know which arguments will matter and which won't. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Dryden gave Victor 2 years at the territorial prison in Deer Lodge with the possibility of early release pending the outcome of the civil proceedings and evidence of restitution to affected debtors. Fitch filed for appeal. The appeal went to the territorial court and was denied 4 months later. Victor Halstead left Red Hollow in May, on a Wednesday, in the custody of 2 territorial marshals, in the same direction he'd arrived from 12 years ago. He left with less than he'd brought, which was its own kind of verdict. Mara was not there to see it. She was at the farm, which is where she usually was, doing the work of a farm in May, which is substantial. She heard about the departure from Edna Cutter the following day and received the informations without ceremony and went back to what she was doing. The civil case settled in June, 4 months after the verdict. Victor, from Deer Lodge, through Fitch, agreed to settlement terms that included repayment of the inflated penalties with interest, which came to $84. He also agreed to a broader damages payment of $300, which Harmon had negotiated with the patience and stubbornness of someone who is very good at this particular kind of work. The banking commissioner's finding of systematic fraud across 11 accounts created a parallel process in which each affected family received a formal notice of their option to pursue recovery. 3 of them retained lawyers, and one of those cases settled within the year. $384 arrived at Harmon's office in late June. He took his fee and sent Mara $270. She held the bank draft for a long time before she deposited it. $270. More money than she'd had in one place since before Thomas died. She could not decide how she felt about it, which surprised her. She had expected the money to feel like resolution. Instead, it felt complicated. It was not enough to erase 14 months of grinding, white-knuckled management. It was not enough to pay for the specific cost of that morning in the trading post when Lydia had looked at herself through Victor Halstead's eyes. There wasn't a dollar amount for that. The money was real and insufficient in equal measure, which was true of most things that tried to stand in for justice. Posited it. She made 2 payments on the Elias loan, ahead of schedule. She had the barn roof repaired properly. The water rights negotiation happened in September, after Pemberton completed the formal assessment. The figure came back at $950 for construction phase access, which landed between Elias's low and high estimates and was, by the assessor's calculation, the fair market price for what the Northern Pacific needed. They negotiated at Mara's kitchen table. It took the better part of an afternoon. She pushed for a slightly higher rate on the ongoing maintenance depot access and got it. He pushed for a longer initial access window, and she agreed to 18 months instead of 12. At the end of it, she had a contract that Harmon had viewed, and a deposit of $200 already in her account, and the remaining $750 due on a payment schedule tied to construction milestones. The ongoing maintenance agreement would generate a smaller but steady annual figure for as long as the depot operated. When they'd both signed, Elias put his pen down and looked at the document for a moment, with the expression of a man completing a calculation. "That took longer than I thought," he said. "You thought I'd move faster? I thought the number would be less contested." "The number was fair," she said. "I contested the terms around the number." He looked at her. Something in his face that had been careful for a long time was slightly less careful than usual, and she saw it and chose, deliberately, not to address it directly, because she was not ready, because being not ready was itself a kind of information, and she was not going to pretend otherwise to make someone else more comfortable. Thomas had understood that about her, 34 years old, and she had not yet decided what the years after Thomas looked like, and she was not going to decide that at a kitchen table over a contract, because the moment felt like it wanted resolution. "Stay for supper," she said. "You don't have to keep feeding me." "I know I don't have to," she said. "Lydia asked if you were coming." He looked at the window. Outside, the September light was the long gold of early autumn, and Biscuit was visible in the yard doing something purposeful with a fence post that probably required adult intervention. The farm had the look of a place being actively tended, the garden still producing, the barn solid with its new roof boards, the south fence repaired and standing level, with a cedar post at the corner that had a crack in it from a rifle shot and was going to stand there for another 20 years regardless. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." Lydia came home at 4 and was not surprised to find him there, and did not make anything of it, which was the particular tact of a child who understands more than she's acknowledged and has decided to be practical about it. Told her mother about a dispute at the schoolhouse over a geography question that she had been right about and the teacher had been wrong about, and she presented her evidence with the systematic approach of someone who intended to be vindicated, and Mara listened and agreed that yes, the Missouri River did in fact originate in Montana, and Lydia looked satisfied. Supper was not ceremonial. It was the ordinary kind beans and salt pork and cornbread, because that was what there was, and there was no reason to pretend otherwise. They ate and talked about the construction timeline, and about Lydia's school, and about a problem with the northwest fence that Mara had been putting off, and that Elias offered straightforwardly to have his men look at when they were free. She said she'd let him know. After Elias left that evening, riding back toward his ranch in the early dark with the last of the gold gone from the sky, and the first stars beginning, Mara stood on the porch for a moment by herself, not watching him go, just standing in the September air, which was the cool, clear kind that smelled of dry grass and the far edge of autumn. She thought about the morning in the trading post. She thought about the gray dress, and the way Lydia had pressed against her side, and the way the room had gone quiet, when Victor picked up his ledger and made a performance of it. She thought about the $17 in her coat pocket that day, and the arithmetic that had never added up, and the specific exhaustion of carrying a problem that someone else had engineered, and that the people around you had simply watched. She thought about what a person does when the world shows them clearly what they're worth in its estimation, and what it costs to keep disagreeing. There is a version of this story where Mara Whitfield is a symbol, where she stands for something larger, and moves through her trouble with the clean efficiency of someone making a point. That version is easier to tell and considerably less true. The real version is a woman who was often afraid and sometimes wrong, and who spent a long time not knowing who to trust and made decisions that were correct in aggregate and costly in the specific. The real version includes the shaking hands, and the nights when the arithmetic refused to balance, and the moments there were several when she sat alone in the kitchen after Lydia was asleep and felt the particular weight of a situation she had not chosen and could not simply decide her way out of. What she had was not extraordinary courage. Most people who survive hard things don't have extraordinary courage. They have the ordinary kind, the kind that shows up because the alternative is worse, that holds together, not because it's never afraid, but because it has a reason to keep going that is larger than the fear. For Mara, that reason had a name and dark braided hair and Thomas's serious eyes. You can do a lot with that, more than you think, and not always as much as you need, and sometimes exactly enough. By the following spring, the construction crews had arrived in the valley. They came with equipment and noise, and the particular chaos of large projects beginning, and they set up their staging area at the east end of the route and began working west. The water access agreement was active. Creek ran where it had always run, dark and sufficient, through the southwest corner of the Whitfield property, and what had once been simply a geographic feature that Thomas had noted and forgotten was now a thing with legal dimensions and economic significance, and a contract attached to it. Mara watched the construction from her property some mornings, when she had a few minutes between tasks. She did not find it sentimental or meaningful in any particular way. It was a railroad being built, which was a practical thing, and the practical result of it, her farm, was a steady deposit every quarter that was making the Elias loan irrelevant faster than the schedule required. She made the final loan payment in July of the following year, 16 months ahead of the 5-year term. She sent Elias the bank draft with a note, 4 words, paid in full, M.W. He sent back a single line, I know. Congratulations. Kept the note, not from sentiment, or not only, but because it marked something. Point at which the arrangement between them, whatever it was no longer transactional. Whatever came after that, whatever shape it took or didn't take, it was not owed or obligated. It was chosen or not on its own terms. She had not decided yet. She was still not ready, in the way that is honest rather than evasive, the way that means the time isn't here yet, rather than the time is never. She was 35 years old, and she had a farm that was solvent and a daughter who was nearly 12 and a border collie who had eaten 2 good hats and showed no remorse. And she had the particular satisfactions of a person who has looked at what they own and found it sufficient. Lydia kept the scrap of gray wool in a small box on her shelf. She had asked for it herself, a piece from the original dress, cut off when Mara had finally remade the fabric into something else in the fall after the trial. It was a small rectangle of worn gray wool, soft from years of washing and repair, with the careful stitching of the old collar still visible at one edge. Mara had thought it an odd thing to keep. She had not said so. She understood, without Lydia explaining it, what it represented, not the humiliation, which Lydia was not going to memorialize, but the before, place they had started from, the distance between that morning in the trading post and the September afternoon, when a contract sat signed on the kitchen table, and supper was beans and salt pork. And it was enough. It was simply enough. Some years later, when Lydia was grown and had her own version of a hard year to survive, she would take out the scrap of gray wool and look at it for a while. And what she would think about was not the men who had tried to take what wasn't theirs, and not even the exact sequence of events that had stopped them. She would think about her mother standing at the southwest fence line in the dark, with a rifle and shaking hands, choosing not to back down. She would think about what her mother had said to her on the walk home from school, when she asked if she should be scared. Careful. There's a difference. That distinction between the fear that freezes and the care that acts, between letting the world tell you what you're worth and continuing, quietly, to disagree, that was the thing Lydia carried. Not as a lesson she'd been taught in any clean, deliberate way, but as something she'd absorbed from standing close enough to watch someone practice it, imperfectly and consistently, over a long enough time that it became the shape of what was possible. The cedar post at the southwest corner stood for 20 more years. It outlasted the construction phase and the maintenance depot and a change in railroad management and a drought that took the wheat 2 seasons running and a good year that brought it back. It stood with its rifle crack sealed over by weather and time, and the flat stone beside it, with Thomas's carved coordinates still legible if you bent close enough to read it, marking the line between what was theirs and what wasn't, in ground that had been surveyed and disputed and documented and fought over and ultimately held. It was just a fence post, and it was also the kind of thing that, in a life, becomes the measure of what you would not give up, which is sometimes the most important thing to know about yourself. Mara knew it. That was enough.